On the night of October the 1st, 2000, the world's eyes turned to Sydney as the closing ceremony of the Olympic Games burst into life. Around Australia, millions of men, women and children watched enthralled as the fireworks erupted over Olympic Park and a river of light flowed from Homebush to Sydney Harbour. But on the other side of the continent, in a remote corner of Western Australia, a much deadlier drama was unfolding. As a small group of men sat by a campfire, a rifle shot rang out, and one of the men slumped forward, fatally wounded. With the shooting began a chain of events that would lead to the assassination of a former chief of detectives and an all-out war between the cops and the Gypsy Jokers. Do you condemn the murder of Don Hancock?
No.
It's a war that the law enforcement authorities insist they are winning. But it's also a war that their critics say has led to failures in the administration of justice and the wrongful conviction of a man for murder.
The blinkers go on and then there is just this one-way traffic to secure a conviction against the person they say is responsible for the crime.
European justice stops at the rabbit-proof fence. Australian justice stops at the rabbit-proof fence. And you come over here, are you in the Wild West? We have different law out here. We have the hanging law.
Tonight on Four Corners, the cops, the bikies, and the hanging law. "70 kilometres northwest of the mining town of Kalgoorlie, Western Australia, lies the tiny settlement of Ora Banda, dominated by the Ora Banda Historical Inn. Gold prospectors come here to camp and fossick for gold around the outskirts of town.
Wow.
Now there's some magnificent pieces.
And that's really quite heavy. This sort of stuff has driven people crazy, you know, you know, it's just heavy bit of yellow stuff.
Author Avon Lovell knows more than most about the value Western Australians place on gold. His groundbreaking book, The Mickleburg Stitch, detailed the way in which three brothers were falsely accused of swindling the Perth Mint out of 49 gold bars.
Yeah, go and talk to your scumbag mates here.
He just called me a scumbag, did he? You heard that from the ex-chief of the CIB, called me a scumbag.
And a criminal.
And a criminal. Just got to get back to
The detective who stitched them up for the crime was the one-time owner of this pub, the former head of the CIB, Don Hancock.
Vision right now, boys.
In the pantheon of corrupt Australian cops, how corrupt was Don Hancock?
He was the best. He never got caught.
In retirement, Hancock became a gold prospector.
He had his local gold mine, his own gold mine, just down the road at Grants Patch called the Wentworth, and he owned the pub and the general store behind that. So pretty much he was the mayor of Ora Banda.
But all that turned sour for Don Hancock when one day a band of Gypsy Jokers rode into town and set up camp. It was October the 1st, 2000. As the bikies drank in his pub and watched the Olympics closing ceremony, tempers frayed. Hancock thought one of the bikies had insulted his daughter Alison, who was working behind the bar. He told them to leave.
There was Hancock stomping around the hotel, furious about it, and his wife telling people that she was worried that Don might go and get a gun.
45 minutes later, as the bikies sat around their campfire drinking, a shot rang out, narrowly missing them and fizzing into the flames of the fire. Soon afterwards, a second shot rang out, and the bikie Billy Grierson fell forward, fatally hit.
Second bullet came through.
injured his back and come out his chest. I was sitting beside him. Open arm around him. Like, yeah, it was pretty sad time. And this is where I live.
OK.
This is where I do all my thinking and all my business. And
Graham Slater was one of the bikies who rode into Ora Banda that day.
he made the regular staff sergeant.
Slim Slater, as he's known, is the Gypsy Jokers sergeant-at-arms. Graham, where did you get that poster from?
That one up there, Bill.
Yeah.
They came out the day after Billy was killed.
Like all club members, he maintains a strict code of silence by refusing to speak to the police or media. Tonight is the first time he's agreed to be interviewed. OK.
It's something I wouldn't have done myself, but...
Did you know that Don Hancock owned the pub?
Never heard of the man until that night.
Immediately after the shooting, Don Hancock was accosted angrily by one of the bikies, Sid Snot Reed.
Reed says, "We know you did it, you bastard." And Hancock gives the only reply that would have to number as the worst reply in the world. "Well, you'll have to prove it, won't you?" I mean, a no would have sufficed, and he threw it right back as a challenge.
As Billy Grierson was buried, notices were posted in a local newspaper threatening Don Hancock. Sid Reed's carried the clearest warning.
"You were taken from us by a cowardly dog. But remember, buddy, every dog has its day."
Hancock was never charged, and the police failure to do so helped fan the flames of the bikies' desire for revenge.
They showed marked reluctance to find out who did it because I think the answer was staring them in the face. And anybody who is really honest will acknowledge that.
What is the answer?
Well, that it was Don Hancock who killed Grierson.
In the weeks that followed Billy Grierson's death, Hancock's pub and home in Ora Banda were wrecked by bombs. And 11 months to the day after the shooting, the bikies' desire for revenge was finally satisfied. On their way home from the races, Don Hancock and his friend Lou Lewis were blown up and killed when their car exploded in front of Hancock's home in Perth.
It was described at the time as an act of urban terrorism, and I think that's probably pretty close to the mark. The killing of a very senior retired officer had sent a shockwave through the police service.
The car bombing stunned Western Australia and helped turn the entire state against the bikies who were seen as the perpetrators of this terrible crime. 8 years on, Graham Slater, who was later charged with the murders but acquitted, shows little sorrow for what occurred that day. Do you condemn the murder of Don Hancock?
No.
Do you condemn the murder of Lou Lewis?
Yeah, well, that was sad. But, you know, way I reckon Hancock killed him himself, possibly by a company, keeping his company, you know. If I had a bike club up to me, there's no way in the world you'd see me with my friends or family. Last place you'd find me.
As a special police task force swung into action, phones were tapped and raids were carried out. Operation Zircon was underway.
We were aware that there was a plot running, so there were a lot of things that were immediately initiated following the bombing. A lot of activity targeting members of that gang to search for explosives and any connection with the bombing.
Three men in particular were in the detectives' sights. Les Hoddy, a founder member of the Gypsy Jokers, Sid Reed and Graham Slater. The police believed the three men were involved in the plot to kill Don Hancock.
Well, everyone was a suspect. They had, everyone was under surveillance, the whole club members and associates. Reed was the number one because apparently they saw him back there at that murder scene that night at a service station close by to the bombing, Lath Lane. So he was one suspect. Now they went for him because they thought he was a weak link, and they kept at him until they rolled him over.
You're looking at your maggot.
Get a good picture?
Sid Reed was a drug addict. It would prove to be his undoing.
He was actually thrown out of the club because he was caught by another member using a needle, which is taboo in our club. That was instant dismissal, that was. I had to go around there and take his colours and dish him up some punishment. That was my job, which I did gratefully. And that was the end of him. He was finished. His membership was terminated.
When was this?
2 days before he got arrested for the murders.
So did that provide a motive, do you think, for him to roll over?
That's when the police seized their opportunity while he was gullible and vulnerable.
They became convinced that Slater was the general and that Sid Reed was the lieutenant. And they started buttering up to Sid Reed, and then ultimately there came a time where they arrested him, put pressure on him in various ways, some of which, out of their own mouths, was quite improper pressure.
Give me an example of that.
Well, they told him that his DNA had been found at the crime scene, which was totally fictitious.
Sid Reed, he broke the Bikie Code of Conduct. He's a dead man walking.
That's what the media said.
Is it true?
I hope so. One day. But then again, I don't care where he is, mate. He can rot in hell. That's where he belongs. He did break the Code of Silence. He broke the Bikie Code. Everything, you know. Everything he done was wrong. You know. He got in bed with the coppers and he could lay with them. Simple as that.
Sid Reed was now the detective Supergrass. He admitted he'd planted the bomb that killed Don Hancock, but agreed to testify that Graham Slater had primed and detonated it. In return, he was told he could expect parole after 15 to 19 years, far less than the 30 years he might otherwise have got for a crime of this magnitude.
He could have been serving 20 plus, maybe even more, given the gravity of the incident.
But Sid Reed saw scope to reduce his sentence even further. Out of the blue, he told the detectives from Operation Zircon that he'd witnessed another murder. He claimed Gary White, a former friend who was close to the Gypsy Jokers, had shot another man dead. A man called Anthony Tapley. Is there anything significant, do you think, in the timing of his alleged revelation that Gary White had murdered Anthony Tapley?
Well, it was only revealed after he was offered the olive branch by those at Zircon to come forward and cooperate and provide as much information as you can, which will lead to a reduction in your sentence. One followed the other.
Are you concerned about what the...
David Capehorn, the officer heading Operation Zircon, asked Tim Atherton, then an assistant commissioner, to sign a letter of comfort to the judge acknowledging Sid Reed's help in solving the mystery of what happened to Anthony Tapley.
Letters of comfort aren't easily granted. The way the judge deals with it is up to him, but it's certainly a letter suggesting that this person has been extremely cooperative and his information or evidence, or information in this case, has been crucial to the resolution of an investigation. And that was the impression that I was given in terms of the briefing that Capehorn gave me.
Sid Reed was duly rewarded for his cooperation. In March 2002, he pleaded guilty to the murders of Don Hancock and Lou Lewis and was sentenced to life imprisonment, but with a recommended minimum term of just 15 years.
Whilst it's one thing to deal with the Sid Reeds of this world and, you know, shall we say, cosy up to them when you want something from them, it's another thing to delude yourself that he's, Father Christmas.
But the detectives believed that all their Christmases had come at once. Gary White was arrested and charged the next day with the murder of Anthony Tapley. According to White, Zircon's detectives offered to fly him to Ireland to start a new life if he'd tell them everything he knew about Graham Slater and the Gypsy Jokers.
They pursued him in the off chance they hoped that he would roll over like Sid Reed. because they couldn't really rely on one lawyer to try and get a successful conviction on me. So they needed two, and he wasn't prepared to do that at all.
What deal did they offer Gary White?
They said to him in those uncertain words that they wouldn't charge him for the murder because they reckon Anthony Tapley was a nobody.
White paid the price for his refusal to roll over. When he came to trial for Ant Tapley's murder, he denied the charge but was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 22 years. Gary White has a checkered past, which includes convictions for assault and possession of offensive weapons. In Perth, he went into the trucking business with the late Les Hoddy, a senior gypsy joker, but he denies being a bikie associate.
Gary can scrap, Gary can stand up for himself, but Gary's not a killer. It's far from it. He'd almost flog you to death if he had to, but he wouldn't kill you. It's no way. It's no way.
You've never known him to be a violent bloke?
Not really, no. I've never seen him in a fight, no. He's a stand-up bloke. He's staunch in that, but no, he's not. He hasn't got a killer instinct in him, no, not at all.
But the killer instinct is just what Sid Reed accused Gary White of having. Behind me is number 12 Jade Street, Maddington, where Sid Reed says that on a pitch-black night like this, Gary White murdered Anthony Tapley by chasing him round the yard and shooting him 6 times. No one else who was here that night says they saw the shooting or heard it. When the yard was dug up for clues and the gates were taken away, the forensic evidence that resulted was at best highly controversial. Tell me what happened that evening.
Aunt come over and I think we'd been at the hotel. We'd actually had some drugs and we thought we'd go over to Whitey's place and keep on drinking and have a bit of a party. The girls were over there cooking up a roast and so we just decided to go over.
Four Corners has spoken to 2 of Gary White's friends who say they were there at the time of the alleged shooting, but deny it happened. Gary White's former girlfriend, Julie Sparks, chose not to give evidence at his trial.
Because I was 3 months pregnant at the time and I told the police I wasn't there because I didn't want stress on the baby and I knew he didn't do it.
She now says that on the night in question, she and White were having dinner out when White received a phone call telling him that his friends were at Jade Street cooking up a roast. Angered by this, he got in the car and went back.
Well, Gary got out of the car, stormed inside, I followed him. He was really angry because I'd spent all day cleaning it and it was just disgusting. They had no respect. So he told all the women to leave and they all left.
According to Julie Sparks, the men stayed. They included Sid Reed, Ant Tapley, and another resident at Jade Street, Dennis Jardine, who had a room overlooking the yard. Julie Sparks' recollection, which has never been tested in court, is that Tapley left Jade Street that night with Sid Reed.
I came to take some rubbish out and I seen Sid and Anthony walking out the gate together and there was a blue Ford, I think it was, and they both got into the car.
So, Dennis, this is number 12, Jade Street, where you lived. Dennis Jardine stayed at Jade Street all night.
That's right, yeah.
Just show me where you lived.
See that window this side of that frame?
Yes.
And that was my room there.
OK. Did you, at any point during the night, hear gunshots?
No.
Would you have heard them if they'd gone off in the yard?
Of course I would have, most definitely.
In question. Jardine was never called to give evidence at Gary White's trial, where Reed had accused him of being involved with the murder. You'd locked the gate and you were outside when Gary White approached Anthony Tapley holding a gun. Is that true?
No. No.
It simply didn't happen?
No.
He also says that the next morning when he came back to the yard, he saw you raking up the ground where Anthony Tapley's body had fallen.
No.
Is that true?
No, definitely not. If it was the next morning, I'd have been at work.
The prosecution at Gary White's trial said that after the shooting, White took Tapley's body to a farm at Northam, an hour-and-a-half's drive away, and burned it on a bonfire. Farmer Wayne Morgan insists he saw Gary White here with 2 other men between 7:30 and 8 a.m. on August the 20th, the morning after the alleged murder.
Yeah, come that morning, there was a fire down in this area here.
Yes.
How big was the fire?
Ten by 10 foot in diameter. Yeah.
How long had it been burning, do you think?
Oh, probably all night. It had burnt down. When I turned up, Les was throwing the burnt out tails of logs and sticks back into the fire.
Did you smell anything unusual?
Didn't smell anything, no.
So you didn't smell burning flesh?
No.
Did you see anything that could conceivably have been a body?
No, I didn't go near it. But no, I didn't see anything like that at all, no.
The prosecution argued that Wayne Morgan's account fitted with Sid Reed's claims. But White denied being at the farm that day. There is now fresh evidence that challenges Wayne Morgan's recollection. Sue Miller, who spent the night at Jade Street, clearly recalls seeing Gary White there the following morning. What time did you leave the next morning?
About 5. 5-ish.
Was Gary White still there?
Yeah, I'm sure he was. Yeah, he was.
How can you be so sure?
Because I think he came into the room and said it's time to go to work or whatever he said. Well, really don't know what he said now because I remember, but I'm 100% sure he was still there.
If true, this means that Gary White couldn't have been at Northam all night. But Sue Miller's evidence that White was at Jade Street on the morning of the 20th was never explored at trial because she was never asked the question. Reed said White had shot Tapley as he scaled the gate in a desperate effort to escape. To bolster his claims against White, the prosecution needed forensic evidence. Police took the gate away for forensic analysis, and scientists analysed a stain which it was suggested may have been Tapley's blood and contained his DNA. Charred bones were found in the remains of the fire at Northam, and these too were analysed.
These things were so important that the prosecutor at the trial described them as the touchstones to the truth when dealing with Reed's evidence, so they were very significant.
This is the same sample from the gate. It's been tested 4 times or 5 times after the...
But tonight, Four Corners can reveal that crucial evidence from the forensic tests was not considered at the trial. Gary White's legal team has hired 2 highly experienced forensic scientists, Brian MacDonald and Barry Botcher, to review the evidence.
This small peak is reportable, 206.
Their conclusions are unequivocal.
Relative heights of peaks.
There is very little of it, I think, is sound in terms of being able to be used in any way to identify the source of the DNA on either the bones or the possible blood on a gate.
My opinion is that the best interpretation is that that stain on the bottom of a gate was not blood at all. What it was, I have no idea.
When the scientists working with the police screened the stain on the gate for blood, the results were mixed. One test, they said, had given a positive reaction, but the follow-up test couldn't confirm it was blood.
The initial screening tests are very sensitive, and in this particular case, the initial screening test was negative. And for me, that said, this is not a blood stain, it's not even an old blood stain, because old blood will give a reaction in this. And that's where it should have stopped. there should be no further tests.
The scientists also tested the stain for DNA and reported finding a partial DNA profile. The jury was told there was a 1 in 60 chance that it belonged to anyone other than Anthony Tapley.
Yeah, this is obviously a mixture.
But the jury wasn't told that the sample was tested 5 times to achieve this result, and crucially, that one reading indicated a mixture of DNA coming from more than one person.
So you can't determine individual genotypes.
There is clear evidence that there's more than one individual contributing to the sample, so the 1 in 60 figure becomes largely meaningless. What we've got is an extremely weak DNA result that shows very poorly reproducible results from the numbers of times that it was tested, and a selective approach has been taken to those variable results and reported.
PathWest scientists are standing by their report. In a written statement, the prosecution's principal scientist denied that a mixture of DNA from more than one person was found. In your view, was the stain on the gate Anthony Tapley's blood?
Based on the evidence that I've seen, no. I don't think any conclusion can be drawn about it being anybody's blood or DNA.
The fragments of bone which were found at Northern were also examined for traces of DNA by the Forensic Science Service in the UK. The suggestion at Gary White's trial was that the bones could have been Tapley's. But Brian MacDonald says that in fact the testing revealed DNA that was not Tapley's. In your view, were the bones found in the remains of the bonfire Anthony Tapley's bones?
Again, I don't think you can say whose bones they are. The only evidence that they have say that they're not.
The jury wasn't told this.
For the benefit of hindsight, it would have been better if we disclosed everything right from the start.
And that would have included the full forensic file?
Absolutely. Well, I assume we would have disclosed everything we had. Whether that was everything that the pathologist had is a different question, and they don't always give us their file, and they may not have on this occasion.
Maybe they should.
Well, I think it's highly desirable that we access everything that's produced.
One potentially decisive test that the UK lab could have carried out was to compare mitochondrial DNA extracted from the samples with mitochondrial DNA donated by Anthony Tapley's mother Elizabeth. Brian MacDonald, who's reviewed the forensic file in detail, says this comparison was never carried out.
Mr. Tapley's mother gave a sample of her mitochondrial DNA to be compared. The laboratory apparently did not test that sample to compare it with the bone.
Or should they have done that?
Well, of course they should have. I mean, that was the fundamental reason for sending it to the UK.
Why did the prosecution fail to ask for comparative mitochondrial DNA tests to be carried out, which could have excluded the bones as being Tapley's?
Well, I thought that's what we were sending to the UK for myself, so I understood the purpose of sending those bones to the United Kingdom was that local labs had no capacity to do any of that analysis, and we sought the assistance of the UK because their facilities are better.
Well, how would you describe the UK laboratory's failure to make that comparison?
Incredulous. We asked the question why they didn't do it, and the explanation was that they only tested if they get comparable results with the crime scene samples. Well, they got a result from the crime scene sample, the bone. They put it through the database. They found that it matched 25% of the population, but they didn't compare it with the very sample that was sent there to compare with. Amazing.
Anthony Tapley's body has never been found. No witnesses other than Sid Reed say that Tapley was shot dead by Gary White. No gun has ever been found, nor have any bullets. Two scientists now agree that the stain on the gate wasn't blood, and the bones from the fire weren't Tapley's. And there's another twist to this story. Anthony Tapley may have been alive when Sid Reed says he was dead. Pamela Yates and her sister Paula Borden, who live in Karratha in northern WA, last saw Ant Tapley in August 2001.
The last night I saw him, he came to my place. He was terrified. People were after him. Apparently, a week prior to that, or around about 2 weeks, he told me while he was up in Headland, he was taken out bush by 4 Indigenous people, and they tied him up to a tree, stripped him, tied him to a tree, taunted him, held a gun to his head, and apparently a phone call came through. One of the people with the phone turned around and said to Ant, "This is your lucky night." So they undid him and took off and left him to find his own way back.
So he must have been very, very scared.
Yes, he was. He was terrified. He was on the run.
Just when he little bloke about 5, he was just such a dear little kid then, and Betsy and Ant was a little baby.
Gary White's trial was told that White had killed Anthony Tapley over a $100 drug debt.
Very early teens.
But Tapley himself had told his father that the men who tied him to a tree and beat him up were after a far larger sum.
There's an issue of some money went missing, and they accused him of taking it. And
how much money was involved?
$70,000.
It is?
Yeah.
And moving on. Anthony Tapley had fallen on hard times. He'd wandered into the world of drugs, bikies and their associates, living at times in the north, around Karratha and Port Hedland, and at times in the south, between Perth and the family home in Walpole.
Would have been a rough time, but it suited him.
His father, Dave Tapley, became concerned. Some months later, he received a horrifying phone call. Just tell me what occurred.
Oh, a lady rang up and she was crying on the phone, and she said, "Dave, I've got some terrible news." And she said, "What's that?" She said, "I told Anthony he'd been murdered." And she wouldn't go into graphics. I pumped her into it, and she told me he'd been decapitated. And I mean, that was, I never told my wife, because to me it wasn't confirmation, and I didn't want to take her through that for nothing.
In November 2001, Dave Tapley reported Ant's disappearance to the police. Inquiries were made by the Missing Person Bureau. Four Corners has obtained a copy of the missing person file, which shows that the police had information that Tapley was still alive on the 26th of August, 1 week after Sid Reed said he was dead, and confirms that the police had identified 3 known criminals as his possible assailants. The file has been studied by Robin Napper, a former detective superintendent and an acknowledged expert in forensic policing.
Has to be a strong suspect in this case.
He's highly critical of the haste with which David Capehorn, the head of Operation Zircon, apparently dismissed the evidence in the file.
Drugs, he's known for illegal firearms. Because Anthony Tapley had had a fearful beating just before he went missing. He'd been chained to a tree, he'd been hit with planks with nails in, he'd been threatened with a gun, and he was a man in huge fear of his own life. Now, to dismiss all that in 24 hours, simply not possible.
Tim Atherton says Superintendent Capehorn didn't tell him that Ant Tapley had been reported alive after Sid Reed said he'd been killed.
Well, my understanding now is that there were some matters in relation to witnesses who knew Tapley that suggests that that he may have been seen in the Karratha area on a date some week or so after the alleged incident at Maddington.
If you'd been told that by David Capehorn at the time, would you have signed the letter of comfort?
No, of course I wouldn't have. No, if there were still unresolved issues in relation to Tapley's whereabouts, I would have insisted on those matters being run out to determine either whether they were accurate, mistaken or confirmed. And only when I was satisfied that the only explanation for Tapley's disappearance was as Reid had suggested, because he'd been murdered at this address in Maddington, and that had been confirmed, would I have been happy to sign a letter of comfort?
They got here, has been missing since about the 26th of August 2001. Now that means...
Reid's allegations had certainly not been confirmed. The missing person file shows that Pamela Yates had told the police that she last saw Ant Tapley alive on the 25th of August. Her sister Paula said she'd spoken to Tapley the next day. At Gary White's trial, after being interviewed by officers seeking to corroborate Sid Reid's story, Pamela Yates and some other witnesses were less certain about their dates than when they first gave statements. But the question remains, was their earlier recollection more accurate? Was Ant Tapley alive after Sid Reid says he was killed?
There are several people who say Mr Tapley was alive then and after, and the jury heard from those other witnesses and formed the view they must have been mistaken.
So Sid Reid was right, and all those other witnesses who said he was alive after the 19th of August were simply wrong?
That's obviously the outcome of the trial, yes.
But there was other evidence from the missing person file which was not put before the jury at Gary White's trial. Detectives from the Missing Person Bureau had spoken to a truck driver called Kent Ginn, who told them he'd given Tapley a lift from Dampier to Karratha around the 24th of August. Should Kent Ginn have been called to give evidence at Gary White's trial?
Absolutely. Crucial witness. If he was indicating to the Missing Person Bureau that he felt the date that he brought Anthony Tapley down was the 24th of August, well, clearly someone's got this wrong. The Crown case says that Anthony Tapley was dead on the 19th. So that needed to be resolved.
Why wasn't Kent Ginn called to give evidence at the trial?
Yeah, he was the truck driver, I think, who gave evidence about Port Hedland. I've asked again about him, and the best of my recollection is that he simply wasn't able to be found at the time of the trial.
Four Corners has found Kent Ginn. He wouldn't be interviewed on camera, but he confirms that he gave Ant Tapley a lift and says he's very clear that it was after the 20th of August, because that's his birthday, and he remembers celebrating it in the Dampier Hotel before giving Tapley a lift to Karratha. He has also confirmed this to White's solicitor.
I've spoken to Mr Ginn. He tells me his birthday's on the 20th of August, and he's sure that it happened after his birthday.
So even if he was wrong by a couple of days, and it was after his birthday, it must have been after the 19th of August.
Absolutely.
When Sid Reid broke the bikie code of silence to give evidence against Gary White, the jury accepted his word.
Mr Slater has pleaded not guilty.
But when Graham Slater went on trial for the murder of Don Hancock, they did not. Slater's barrister Colin Lovett zeroed in on the claims made by Reid to the detectives from Operation Zircon.
I spent quite some time with it because it was a devastating litany of lies. And when the foreman announced his verdicts, I've never heard anything like it. He said, not guilty each time, almost a denunciation of the prosecution case.
Oh, actually, I knew I had it in the bag because they all smiled at me when they came out. And even the judge smiled at the verdict. He was happy with it too. Yeah, so no more than me, though. I was hysterical.
8 months after their disastrous failure in the trial, prosecutors put Graham Slater, Gary White, Les Hoddy and 2 other men on trial again, this time for the bombings at Ora Banda. Sid Reid again gave evidence. The verdict again was not guilty. You represented Gary White at that trial?
I did, yes.
What, in your view, was the strength of the evidence against him?
Wholly dependent upon Reid's credibility, and Reid himself, in the defence submission to the jury, was just a totally unbelievable witness.
In the trial of Graham Slater, again and again and again in cross-examination, he admitted he'd lied about specific events.
That's right.
So your assertion would be that, yes, he lied repeatedly, or he admitted he'd lied repeatedly in two trials, in the Graham Slater trial and the Ora Banda trial, but he was telling the truth in the Gary White trial.
On critical issues, yes.
Neither David Capehorn nor the Western Australia Police would appear on this programme. In 2006, Gary White lost an appeal. But armed with this new evidence, his legal team will soon submit an application to the State's Attorney General, inviting him to exercise the royal prerogative of mercy to send his case back to the Court of Appeal. Another fresh piece of evidence will be this statement, alleging that in late December 2001, several months before he rolled over, Sid Reed confessed to a friend that he'd killed a man. The friend, whose name is David Hitchcock, says Reed told him,
"I've chased someone around a yard. I shot him as he ran to the gate. He tried to scale the fence. When he did that, I lined him up and shot him in the arse from underneath him. He fell off the fence, and I walked up to him and shot him in the head."
So the circumstances that he described to Hitchcock were almost identical to the way in which he described Gary White as having murdered Tapley. The only change seems to have been that in that story to Hitchcock, Reed was inserting himself. And we regard that as significant because Reed had told the various trials that, in one way you can tell a lie is to insert yourself into a true story or take someone else out of a true story, insert someone else in. And so we regard that as significant for that reason.
There are now 4 plausible suspects for the murder of Ant Tapley apart from Gary White. They include the 3 men identified in the missing person file and Sid Reed himself.
I have, in my view, no doubt that this is a miscarriage of justice. And although I can't say whether a person is guilty or not guilty, innocent I should say, that's not the test before the court. I have no doubt that in this case there is a reasonable doubt as to the guilt of Gary White.
So does Gary White deserve a retrial?
On the basis of some of the information that I've been privy to, I think there should be serious consideration given to Gary White being given an opportunity to put his case again to a court of law, yes.
Dave Tapley believes that Gary White did kill his son, but that the full truth is yet to emerge. 9 years on from the shooting of Billy Grierson and 8 years on from the murders of Don Hancock and Lou Lewis, families are still in mourning and still seeking some kind of closure.
We had a memorial service in Walpole. Just had to do something, mate. We couldn't have a funeral. Just no body, no nothing. A few little bones I got had to send to England to be powdered up into paste for trying to get DNA, which they couldn't properly, I made a table, a chair thing put in the park with a plaque with his name on it, memory plaque. It's all I could do.
Do you feel any sense of closure now?
Probably not. It's a silly thing, mate. When I look in the football, I look in the crowd, I see people look like Anthony. You're still always hoping that he's still alive somewhere, So I guess you can't call it closure.
You can see this program again or watch any other